I am Mr. Skinner. I am your teacher. I am not your best friend. It's not supposed to work that way. Teachers and students are not supposed to be buddies. You will work from bell to bell in here every single day of the school year. There will be no free days. You cannot leave here to go somewhere else. If you forget something in another class, it's tough. You cannot go. Bring everything with you. No phones at all. No phones until the last 5 minutes of the class so that you can photograph homework. You can't have the phone on your desk, in your hand, in your lap, nothing, and no texting whatsoever. If you choose to use your phone other than the last 5 minutes, then you're going to lose your phone. I take it it's gone for a day. You don't get it back until the next school day. So if it's a Friday, you have problems. No exceptions for anybody. Assign seats. We've already taken care of this. Bring your own paper and pencils. Don't come into this class with nothing in your hand. You should have a notebook and something to write with. I'm not going to give you paper. I'm not going to give you pencils. The only paper I give you is from that orange bucket back there. Speaking of the orange bucket, when you come into class, you have to pick up some paper from that orange bucket. You will use this paper to write your answers and deliver them to my desk. I only need the answer and your last name on it. I don't need the work. You're going to show the work on notebook paper that you have to save. For example, if the answer is 25 and you write this, which is really small, and then you put your name underneath of it, I'm just going to pass you through because I'm not going to squint or get a microscope out to look at it. If the answer is 25 and this is your piece of paper, fill up the whole piece of paper and then put your last name underneath of it so it's easy to read. If you write it really small, I'm not going to count it. No textbooks. We're not going to do textbooks, just like every year in here. They're not worth much. I can give you everything you need. Everybody must keep a 3-ring binder. You have 8 weeks to get a 3-ring binder. They're really cheap, $2.50 at Walmart, something like that. In that 3-ring binder, you must keep your work from the practice problems. When you do a problem in here, you show your work on the notebook paper, but write your answer on the little piece of paper. Homework, tests, quizzes, after-test assignments, everything. It's worth 1,000 points. You either have it or you don't, and it's checked once each 9 weeks at the end. Tests, you only get one chance to take each test, so study well for it. There are no do-overs. Last year I gave multiple attempts. I'm not doing that anymore. People come in and they don't study for the test. They bomb the first one to see what's on it, and then they just keep taking it over and over until they get it right, and we're not going to do that. If you miss a test or a quiz because you are absent, then you will take it during 6th period. You must give a 1-day notice when you are ready to take it, so I can make a different version of the test. The different version of the test that I have to give you because you were absent is going to be shorter and more difficult. So come to school and don't miss anything. You can only take 1 per day. Some people miss weeks of school. Why, I don't know, but so they'll have 3 tests to take, but you can only do 1 a day. I am not interested in personal stuff, so we're not going to discuss all of that in here. It is time to go. Here's the warm-up quiz. I know the direction says to lay it on the desk, but you're going to show it to me as you go by. Don't drop this one off up here. Show it to me as you go by. Only bring the answer. Do not bring the work. Just the answer on a little piece of paper with your last name at the bottom. Here's the first one. Evaluate x minus 3y for x equals 3 and y equals -1. For this problem, x is 3, so you start off with a 3, minus 3 times y. Y is a -1. You have 3, and it's minus 3 times a -1. Minus 3 times a -1 creates a double negative in here. So it becomes 3 plus 3, which would be 6. So if you missed that, it's no big deal. We're going to do these warm-ups all year long to practice basic math and algebra stuff so that you can get better at it. Try this one. You have 2 times x. X is 5. And then minus 3 times y. Y is negative 2. 2 times 5 is 10. And then you have that double negative generated there, which is 6. 3 times 2 will be 6. So the answer is 16. If you ever have a question about any of these, just stop me and ask me what it is. Try this one. If you're the last one to come up, then you can say your answer out loud. We have a negative y out front. Now you're putting in a negative 1 for y. There's already a negative sign there, but that doesn't mean you eliminate it. That means you put in a negative 1 there. And then of course the x is 6. Negative 1 is what? What's a negative 1? Positive 1. And then I have minus 3 times 6. That's minus 18. 1 minus 18 is going to be a negative 17. Try this one. 3 times y. Y is 2. And then minus 3 times x. X is 3. 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times 3 is 9. Subtract the 2 to get negative 3. Last one. Try this one. On the warm-up problem, you have a negative 2 times x, and you're putting negative 2 in for x, and a negative 3 in for y. Negative 2 times negative 2 is 4, and you have a double negative there, which changes to plus. So you should have 7 for that answer. Here's a bonus while we give some extra time. X plus 3y plus z, and this is for x equals 4, y equals 2, and z equals negative 1. On the bonus problem, the answer should have been 9. Alright, each day we'll do a lottery. Just pick a number from 1 to 5, put your last name on it, and drop it off up here on the desk. The winning number today is going to be 2. This is the homework check. Of course, you didn't have homework over the summer, but we'll have a homework check tomorrow. It's worth 50 points, and I'll explain more about it tomorrow. And the homework answers. Homework answers are extra credit. You'll get 50 points if you show all the work on your homework for each problem. So you can't fail homework if you show effort on everything. When we go through the answers to check right and wrong, for however many you have right, you'll get an extra point on your homework grade. So you could end up with 60 out of 50 for homework, which is extra credit. Today's objective. You don't have to write these down because I will be putting them on the board around the room soon. But there's a whole new set of objectives for this year. The OGT is gone. Of course, most of you have already taken it. But there's a whole new set of standards that have to be taught. It's called Common Core, and here's the first one you're going to be doing today. Know there is a complex number I, such that I squared is negative 1, and every complex number has the form a plus bi, with a and b real numbers. And you should be able to, after we finish this topic, define I as the square root of negative 1, or define complex numbers, write complex numbers in the form a plus bi, with a and b being real numbers. Yes, very good. With a and b being real numbers. All right, example. Now in this example, there should be a square root sign there. I left it off. This doesn't change. I is an imaginary number, and it's equal to the square root of negative 1. That does not change. Once you write it down and know it, that's the same forever. I equals the square root of negative 1. So now we have to build on that. you're going to have to simplify these imaginary numbers with exponents, but you have to be able to start from the bottom up. I squared is the same as I times I. Because you know when you multiply variables together that are the same, you add the exponents. So it's really I to the first, I to the first. When you multiply them together, you get I to the second. Remember what I was? What did we say I was? Square root of negative 1. So I squared is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1, because it's two i's multiplied together. Now we'll add a blank screen in here and go back to this. If I multiply square root of 1 by itself, what is the answer? Just negative 1. Anytime you multiply two square roots together that are the same, the answer is the number under the square root sign. So it's negative 1. This does not change. Once you know that I squared equals negative 1 and you keep that in your list, you never have to work that out again. So now we have I and I squared. Can you remember what I was? What is I? Square root of negative 1, right. So I squared is what now? Just negative 1, right. So we're going to go on and look at this. What if I had a perfect square such as the square root of 4 and I multiplied it by itself, square root of 4? Do you know what the square root of 4 is? Square root of 4. 2, yes. So if I multiplied those two together, what's 2 times 2? 4, right. Here's another one. What if I had the square root of 9 times the square root of 9? What is the square root of 9? 3. So I have two 3's multiplied together. What is the answer? 9, yeah. Here's another one. What if I had the square root of 16 times the square root of 16? What's the square root of 16? 4. So I have two 4's multiplied together, and what do I get? Do you notice a pattern here? Anytime you multiply a square root by itself, the answer is what? It is that number under the square root sign. So square root of 9 times itself, it's that number under the sign that turns out to be the answer. So now we're moving up to I to the third. How can we break up I to the third? What can I write? Just in terms of i's. How can I break up I to the third in terms of i's only? Right, yeah, you can put I times I times I. Because each one of those are an exponent of 1. When you multiply them together, you add the exponents and you get 3. So I to the third is 3 i's multiplied together. There is a way that you can simplify this. Instead of writing out all 3 i's, you could do something else. Remember, we're trying to break up 3. So you can add 1, 1, and 1 and get a 3. How else can I get a 3 from addition? 2 and 1. So you could also do I squared times I. Do you remember what I squared was? Negative 1. I squared is negative 1. So if you remember that, you can replace that I squared with a negative 1. And then you're left with an I. You are never going to write square root of negative 1 when you're simplifying these out. If you end up with just an I, you're going to leave it as an I. So now I have negative 1 times I is just a negative I. This will never change. Add this to your list. I to the third is negative I. Things you have to keep in mind on this, things you need to know to be successful at this are the following. you have to know that if I multiply a negative 1 by an I, it's a negative I. You have to know that if I multiply two i's together, it's I squared. You have to know that if I have I times I squared times I, it's I to the fourth, because these are exponents of 1. There, you have 1, 2, and 1. Adds up to be a 4. Basic things you have to remember. All right, before we go on to the next one, do you remember what I was? Square root of negative 1. What's I squared? Negative 1. What was I to the third? Negative I. Very good. So now we go to I to the fourth. Can you tell me how I can break up I to the fourth? There's more than one way. Very good. I squared times I squared. What was I squared? Negative 1. I squared was negative 1. So instead of writing I squared times I squared, we can now write negative 1 times negative 1. What is negative 1 times negative 1? 1, right. So now we know that I to the fourth is 1. And that's never going to change. You could have also broken this up as I times I times I times I, but you would just be going back and combining them together. You could have had those three i's for I to the third times I, and then simplify from there, but this is the easiest way. Okay, so again, I is square root of negative 1, I squared is negative 1, I to the third is negative I, and I to the fourth is 1. Here's I to the fifth. How can I break up I to the fifth? All right, I to the third times I to the second. That adds up to be 5. What was I to the third? Negative I. And what was I to the second? Negative 1, right. So what is a negative times a negative? A positive. So if I know that those negatives are going to cancel out, I have really I times 1. What is I times 1? I. So I to the fifth is just I. And that's not going to change. So we've added that to our list. I is square root of negative 1. I squared is negative 1. I to the third is negative I. I to the fourth is 1. And I to the fifth is I. Keep that in your list. Here's a practice problem. See if you can break up I to the sixth and simplify it. Bring it up here and drop it off on my desk when you get an answer. On the practice, I have I to the sixth. Now you could break that up as I to the third and I to the third. But when you break imaginary numbers up with odd exponents, if you're going to use odd exponents to break them up, it's going to take you longer to get to the answer. If you can break them up with even exponents like this, then you'll have a better chance of getting the answer faster. You can also break it up as I to the fourth, I squared. Any one of those three would work. This would take the most time. This would take the second longest time. This will be the easiest here. I to the fourth is what? 1. What's I squared? Negative 1. What's 1 times negative 1? Negative 1, right. All right, if you had negative 1, come on up here and get your paper and show it to me. I to the eighth, you can break it up as I squared, I squared, I squared, and I squared. Or you could have broken it up as I to the fourth, I to the fourth. What is I to the fourth? 1. So 1 times 1 is 1. Here's another bonus problem while Preston is working. See if you can break up I to the ninth. The one we just did was I to the 8th. Do you remember what the answer was? Positive 1. So I could break up this as I to the 8th and come up with I to the 9th. So if I to the 8th was 1 and I multiply it by I, what should I get? I. Right. And you can add that one to your list as well. Here's another example. And in this example, I'm going to show you a trick to doing these problems that will let you do them almost instantaneously. If you learn these patterns that I'm going to show you, you can do them just as fast as Micah Lewis and Dylan Deerfield. They know the pattern just like that. They just have to look at it and boom, they've got the answer. All right, I to the 4th. Do you remember what I to the 4th was? It was 1. What was I to the 8th? No. It was 1 as well. What do you think I to the 12th is going to be? I to the 12th is 1. What's I to the 16th? 1. Exponents that are multiples of 4 are always going to give an answer of positive 1. So if I get one that looks like this, I to the 48th, can you imagine how long that would take if you broke it up by 2's? Does 4 go into 48? Yes, it does. Answer is 1, and you're finished. If I had I to the 30th, does 4 go into 30 evenly? No, it doesn't. So that one would not be 1. Can you name the next exponent that's lower than 30, but is a multiple of 4? 28. So I to the 28th. And what do I have to add to 28 to get to 30? I to the 28th is going to be what? 1. And what's I squared? I squared is negative 1. So the answer is what? Negative 1. So you've just done I to the 30th like that. And I to the 48th. Okay, do you remember what I was? Square root of negative 1, right. Do you remember what I to the 3rd was? It was negative I. What about I to the 5th? I. I to the 7th. How can I break up I to the 7th? That's right. What's I to the 4th? What's I to the 3rd? Negative I. What's 1 times negative I? Negative I. Okay. What do you think I to the 9th is going to be? It will be I. After the exponent of 1, all odd exponents will give you alternating answers of negative I and I. So if I to the 3rd is negative I, and I to the 5th is I to the 7th is negative I to the 9th is I. What's I to the 11th? Negative I. What's I to the 13th? I. That can come in handy. So you'll know if it's an odd exponent, it's going to be an I or a negative I. One of the two. If you only know one of them every 15 times, let's say that you can only remember I to the 13th is I. If you end up with an I to the 26th in a problem, you'll know that I to the 13th is I. So you would have I to the 13th and I to the 13th to break it up, and you get it really quick. Here's another example. What's I squared? It's negative 1. I squared is negative 1. What's I to the 6th? Do you remember what it was? Negative 1. What do you think I to the 10th is? Negative 1. I to the 14th, negative 1. I to the 18th, negative 1. If you start with the exponent of 2 and add 4 each time, so if your exponents are 2, 4, not 2, 4, that's ridiculous. I can't even count. If your exponents are 2, 6, 10, 14, 18, 22, and so on, if you start with 2 and you add 4 each time, then your answers will always be negative 1. So if you end up with a even exponent, but it's not a multiple of 4, then the answer is going to be negative 1. Remember that example we did with I to the 30th? Remember I showed you I to the 30th, and we broke it up as I to the 28th and I squared? And we knew that this one was going to be 1 and that one's negative 1, so the answer is negative 1. This is one of those instances where it's an even exponent and it's not divisible by 4. So the answer is negative 1. And we're going to practice this the rest of today, tomorrow, until everybody gets going pretty good. And then pretty soon you'll be able to look at it and just do it. Won't be much to do except for your homework. Your homework is graded based on effort. If you don't write the problem number, the problem, and show all work for each problem, then you get no points. Show all work necessary for each problem. If you skip steps, then I can't give you points. It's worth 50. And if you get right answers, it's 1 point each on top of that. So you could get extra credit. This is tonight's homework. Write the problem number, write the problem, and show all work that's necessary. Now is the time that you can get a phone out with a camera, point it at the screen, and take a picture. So you don't have to write it down right now before the bell goes off. You can have it on your phone and look at it later on. Also, if some of you don't have a phone, but you have internet at home, like a desktop computer, this is going to be on my website tonight.